Today's webinar is all around NPS reporting, what needs to be in your reporting, and what makes sense to make it valuable for the organization. What you'll find about today's webinar is also that the approaches and techniques we talk about are relevant to lots of different customer feedback processes, not just NPS. So you'll find work for CSAT, and the same approaches will work for different styles of customer feedback metrics. Today's high-level agenda is quite straightforward. We really have two areas that we want to talk about. The first area is all about the high-level issues that you need to understand in the business. There are some areas and some ideas that are really important to understand in how we're going to approach the reporting process, and that's what we'll talk about in those areas. The second part is we'll actually dive into the 9 critical NPS reporting elements. These are the elements that you really need to understand, and these are the main meat of the conversation that we'll have today. First off, I just wanted to introduce Genro. We've been around since around 2001, so about 15 years now. We've helped a wide range of organizations in that time, from B2B to B2C organizations in lots of different industries. And our focus has really been around customer feedback, customer loyalty management, net promoter score, and customer experience management. So we're a consultancy that have been helping organizations for quite some time in this space. A little bit of an introduction to myself. My name's Adam Ramshire. I'm the founder and owner of Genro. I've spent the last 15 years helping organizations understand their customers and helping them to change and drive their business to better support customers and have better experiences. So my focus and my experience is mostly around customer feedback, net promoter score, customer experience management, and also quality systems and processes. My customers have included both B2B and B2C organizations, and they've also included small companies and large global organizations. So I have an understanding of both styles of organization. Also, from an industry perspective, a lot of different organizations I've worked with, from engineering to software to finance to technology, banking. So a large range of different industries. And the ideas that we talk about here and that we'll talk about in this webinar today are relevant to all those different industries. Lastly, I'd like to share as much information around Net Promoter Score and customer feedback and execution as I can, and all of that information goes up onto our blog. So there's about 250 blog posts up there that I've written over the years, and you can read them, and there's a lot of detailed information, and in fact I'll send you across to some of those blog posts today because they have some great detailed information. So let's just start out about and understand exactly what this NPS report is going to be for. What's the goal of our NPS report? There's really a couple of areas that are important. The first one is charting the course. So of course we're going to report on Net Promoter Score. We're going to report on what the number is. But the most important thing about reporting on what that number is actually reporting on it in such a way as you can either identify whether to take action or whether to not take action. So it's just as important to identify when the score has changed in an insignificant way or a not real change, a statistically insignificant way, as it is to identify when a real change has occurred in the score. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The other thing is to focus your business on the right things. It's very easy to focus on a number, and Net Promoter Score is a great number, but it's very easy to have the business focus on just the number. So what we'll also talk about a lot today, and what the goal of your report should be, is actually to broaden the organizational focus away from just providing or just focusing on that one number to be focusing on lots more things around the business, to actually focus on what's driving the score in the long term. So they're the two big goals here. Identify when you want to make a change, or when you're identifying when there is a real change or whether there is not a real change, and that's a really important difference, and then focusing on the real things. So there are some really high-level issues to understand, and this is the first area of the webinar that we'll talk about. So the first really important thing to know or to understand or to be aware of is that NPS is sample data and not exact, so you'll need to do some statistics. So what's really important to understand is that revenue and cost and employee numbers, these are all hard numbers in your organization. You can count every dollar of revenue, you can count every dollar of cost, you can count how many offices there are, you can count how many orders have been tracked, you can count all these numbers exactly. So you can report on these numbers as one number and as exact numbers. So that's really a characteristic of those sorts of numbers. What's different about NPS is that NPS is a sample number. So it's very unlikely that you'll have a 100% response rate for any of your surveys. So what comes back out of that, and what you need to understand from that, is that the number that you have, the number that at the end of the day is written down as your NPS score, is really just an approximation of what the NPS score is for the whole population of all of your customers. And I liken it to catching some fish and using them to make predictions on all of the other fish in the lake. So if you've landed some fish, look at them, size them, you can make some predictions, but you can't know exactly what the whole lake of fish looks like. So we need to do some stats, and we need to be aware that this number, although we write it down quite a lot as one number, is actually a range or an approximation or an estimate, however you want to talk about it, of the actual Net Promoter Score for the whole business. So that's a really important thing to understand as you go forward. The second thing to understand is that the score, focusing on the score is very, very easy because it's a number and you can chart it, and people want to talk about the score. But because it's so easy, it's the thing that people will focus on the most, and sometimes exclusively, unless you guide them. And I've talked about an idea here about target fixation. This is a real problem for people like motorcycle riders. So this target fixation is where people, human beings, get focused on a particular thing or a particular target and then actually don't divert from that target until they run into it. And it's a problem for motorcycle riders because, you know, they focus on the lamppost and then they run into the lamppost rather than focusing to the side of the lamppost and riding around it. It's a key issue for motorcyclists. But I want to get this idea of target fixation, because we focus on the score so much and so often that that's all we ever talk about. Whereas the score is really just a number that keeps track of where we're up to. It's not the only thing that we need to think about. So be aware that the score is important, yes. It's much more important to tell people what to do with the score and understand the score and how to change the score than it is necessarily just the score. So just be aware of that. The next thing, and a question that we get an enormous amount in our business, is that customers will come to us and say, well, we've got this response, and here's a typical example. I love company X, but I make it a policy never to recommend insurance companies. So what a lot of people will say to ask or ask us is, well, this score seems wrong. Maybe we should just change the score. Maybe we should change it to another number, change it to something else, because clearly the customer's made a mistake, or it's not relevant, or somehow this particular response from this customer should be taken out of the survey. So what I want to do is I want to do a quick audience poll to just ask what people would do with this number themselves. So here are the questions. How would you change the score? Would you change that score to a 10? Would you change it to an 8? Would you delete the score? Would you delete the response completely, or would you do nothing? And I'll just pop back for a couple of seconds so you can see what that question is. I love company X, but make it a policy never to recommend insurance companies with a would recommend equals 0. So what would you do with that score? Okay, let's close the poll now and have a look at the results. So here's the way people have responded on the poll. So what we see is that most people, over 60%, would do nothing. Some people would delete the response. A proportion of people would delete the score itself. And some people would change the score to a 10. So they would take the 0 and turn it completely into a 10. But what we have here is a bit, I guess, a bit under 40%, maybe 35% of people would actually do nothing. The other 35% would actually try and change that score. Okay, interesting. Let's go to a different version of the same sort of question. So here we have another style of question, or another question, or another response, sorry, that's come back. Your local office is really terrible at calling me back, but given a would recommend of 10, which kind of seems counterintuitive. It doesn't seem like it should be right. So maybe we should change this score as well. So let's do the same thing here. So quick audience poll. So how would you change the score? Would you change the score to a 0? Would you change the score to a 6? Would you delete the score, delete the response, or do nothing? So we'll just hold off a sec while people respond. So here are the responses from this answer, and this is also very interesting. A lot more people here, now up over 80%, maybe 85% of people, would do nothing. Some would still delete, maybe 10% would delete, maybe 10% would change the score from a 10 to a 0. So what you see here is last time it was 65% would do nothing, now it's 85% would do nothing. The real problem that we run into is that, as you can see, To be honest, doing nothing is the only really sensible approach that we can take to this particular question. When it comes to changing schools, when you start this kind of slippery slope, if you like, to starting to change schools, you identify so many different questions and so many different ways to do this that you spend more time worrying about what the question is and what the score should be than actually doing it. You know, the questions you get is how wrong is wrong? Do we change 10s or just 9s, or do we change 5s or just 0s? We don't change 10s. Who decides who's going to make the change? Is there an appeals process? There are just so many questions that the organization builds up that the thing is you actually spend all of your time arguing and not doing. So this is kind of like the target fixation I talked about earlier. You know, these questions we just focus on these questions. We talk about the questions all the time. We talk about how the score should change. We spend less of our time actually doing something with the information. And besides, all of this is kind of academic because the absolute NPS means nothing. So the way the NPS process works, relative NPS is much, much more important to you than any sort of absolute number. And so long as the sampling process is consistent, so long as you don't change how you actually collect the data, so long as the survey stays the same, so long as the audience stays the same, this relative change will not change. The number of people that will give you 10s for those sorts of questions or 0s and to be confused or give answers that you think are wrong will stay pretty much consistent. So it actually doesn't make any difference at all to the actual changing of the business or the driving of the score. So our recommendation would always be don't make any changes, just run with what you already have and don't change the scores at all. The next question we'll talk about is integrating top-down and bottom-up scores. So top-down scores are relationship surveys. These are surveys that you run every 3 months or 6 months or maybe once every year. And they talk about how a person interacts with the whole organization. On the other hand, transactional NPS is this bottom-up idea where we talk to customers after an individual transaction that they may have been through with us. There's often an urge or a question from customers to say, well, how do I integrate these two scores? How do I integrate the bottom-up and the top-down? And the really simple answer is you can't. The scores are done in different ways. They're measuring slightly different things. They're just not relevant to try and push the two together. There's no point trying to average them. There's no point trying to compare them in any way. The only real approach you can take is actually to report them separately, to report a relationship number and a transactional number for the business. So when you have these top-down and bottom-up scores, just don't try and integrate them together. Just report them separately. Okay, they're the kind of big themes that I wanted to talk about. So now what we'll do is we'll go in and talk about the critical reporting elements. So the first thing that you're going to need to understand and you're going to need to approach is how you're going to handle these small sample sizes. The issue with Net Promoter Score is that the margins of error can be quite large for Net Promoter Score. So you'll see here that we've got a stack of data. Typically, I would say anything under about 100 responses becomes quite difficult to manage, and the error rates go up quite substantially. So you want to keep about 100 responses or more in your sample size. You'll see here that's a problem because January, March, and July have fewer than 100 responses. So that's kind of a problem. Now, even if you have large sample sizes, even if you may have thousands of responses you get a month or a week, or even a year, the issue that you'll find is that as you segment and sub-segment those responses down, the size of the segment, and you'll see what we're talking about here, Texas, just a smaller and smaller segment, at some point you're going to run into this small sample size issue. You're going to run into having just too few responses. So you do need some way to analyze and use these small sample sizes. And there's really a couple of kind of good approaches to doing this. The first one is to use rolling values. So this is the idea of rather than just looking at January, looking at a rolling 3 months to January. So add up the promoters from January, February, March and report them in March as rolling 3 months. This works quite well because you can grow the sample size that you've got. You can see our sample sizes are now double or triple what they were in the last slide or in the top level there. You do have to be aware of a couple of issues here. The one issue is that as this rolling occurs, it can be more difficult to identify a problem in the business. Say, for instance, something has occurred in January. Because you're using this rolling approach, it can take a little bit of time to identify that issue because you're putting together 3 months worth of data. So that it can delay you finding a particular issue in the business. On the other hand, by rolling it up, it has the real advantage that you won't be jumping at shadows. You won't be looking for problems that really don't exist in the customer base. And I think it's much more important that you don't constantly second guess and look and try and explain changes that aren't really there. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. The other thing is desegmenting. So we went from kind of Texas down to Lakewood's Woodlands Drive. We can now go up. So roll your data up in region or demographics or touch point or whatever it happens to be for your business. Roll it up till you have a decent sample size, and that's a really important thing to think through. So there are two ways to approach this: rolling values, which is to use data from the past, or roll up data from multiple periods, or this desegmenting, which is to bring groups together. Just make sure those groups are similar and make sense so that you're not misunderstanding what might be happening in a subgroup because they get rolled into a larger group. So rolling values is probably the best approach there. Next, I want to talk about something that occurs quite a lot, and this is this idea of apophenia, which is the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns within random data. And I have to say, this is a real problem because very often we're analyzing Net Promoter Scores and trying to put some sort of explanation as to why it's occurring. And the simplest and most common example I know of this is the share market and the share market commentators. You look at the morning news, and the share market commentators always have a reason of why the market went up or down or didn't change, why everything has changed. You'll always hear that share market explanation next morning. Most times, I don't know whether they're right. I suspect most times they just need to put something on the news to talk about. But this idea of putting meaning in where there is no meaning is really important. So that's the share market analogy. So what we want to do is we actually want to prevent that from happening. So we do that by putting some data into our some analysis into our data. So when we include any statistics around Net Promoter Score, what we also need to do is include some stats to clearly identify real change and prevent this issue from occurring. So we need to report some type of margin of error or statistical test to call out the real changes in the business. And we need to do this by using some stats. And what we'll do is I'll talk about the stats in a few seconds. But what this really does is it prevents over-explaining. So over-explaining is where there's a change in the business or an apparent change in the business, but actually there's no change in the score because it's just a statistical aberration. So you need to be able to report this in some way to prevent this over-explaining. The kind of problem with Net Promoter Score is that you get this idea around, did my NPS really change? Because NPS is a little complex, to be honest with you, and the stats on NPS are a little bit more complex than most other styles of customer feedback score. So the question, did my score go down or did it not go down, is quite complex. Now, I'm not going to go into the stats here today because that would be a whole hour-long session in and of itself. And there will be a link in the follow-up email to this, so you don't have to take it down now. But if you download or you go to this page on our website, it talks all about how to do the margin of error stats. You can also download a tool to make it easy, so you just dial the numbers in, and it'll tell you whether the NPS score has changed. But that's a really important part of the process. You really need to do that to make sure that you're not kind of over-identifying issues in the business or over-identifying changes in the business. Also, this is not really a full discussion on sample sizes. We talked a little bit about sample sizes earlier today. This is not a full discussion on sample sizes, but there is a whole webinar just based on that, and there's a link there. Again, that link will also be in the email that comes along after the presentation. So I now have a question about goaling frontline staff, and we get talked about this a lot. So I'm just going to open up a quick poll on how you goal frontline staff with respect to NPS. So here are the questions. So do you link personal NPS to remuneration? Do you link team NPS, company NPS? Do you not link NPS to remuneration? And maybe you can't track NPS by person. So if we could just have people respond on that, because I think it's a really important part of the process. Okay, I'll just go a couple more seconds, a couple more votes coming in. Again, really interesting. Really interesting. Okay. So let's have a look at those responses. And actually, I think, so we've got some people that can't track NPS per person. That's cool. So 34% don't link NPS remuneration, 20% do it at the company, 20% at the team level, and a small percentage, 10% at the personal level. And I actually think this is quite a good outcome. I get a lot of questions and conversations and get asked a lot about this stuff, about how do we link NPS to personal staff remuneration. And I think this is actually pretty good. This is actually pretty good. That looks pretty good. So let's talk a little bit now about incentivizing frontline staff and how actually there's not a great link to customer satisfaction or service quality. So this is a piece of research that was done. This is the outcomes from a piece of research that was done a little while ago. And it looked at how service quality and customer satisfaction are impacted. What are the things that drive service quality and customer satisfaction? This is a multi-store retail environment. So it was really driven by a couple of things. It was driven by store level performance. It was also driven by employee service performance. Cool. But then the question became, what drives employee service performance? And there were two levels of this. So at the employee level, there was the idea of conscientiousness, neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and employee involvement. There were, at the store level, there was employee involvement, training, performance incentives, which is exactly what we're talking about here, and service climate. So when they did the research, they found some pretty substantial linkages between all of those employee level ideas. But what they didn't find was any linkage between performance incentives and service equality and customer satisfaction. So what was more important at the store level was employee involvement in decision making and the service climate within the organization. So and even in this case, service training didn't turn out to be particularly important. And the authors suggested that might be because that was picked up through service climate and employee involvement. So what's really interesting here is goaling frontline staff on NPS is not necessarily going to make them perform any better. And that's the real crux of what I want to talk about here. I'd probably even roll it up to the team level, at the team level as well. So incentivizing staff doesn't necessarily drive service quality. What drives service quality is things like employee involvement, service climate, tools and systems and processes are making it easy for employees to be successful. These are the things that really drive employee service performance. The other thing, so incentivizing NPS doesn't necessarily drive customer service or customer satisfaction. What it does drive, and there's no doubt about this at all, and I'm sure everyone on this call has had an example of where they've been score-begged by an organization, and here's a classic example. So what everybody has occurred is that because the organization is target-focused, and we talked about this, target stuff earlier, we've now, and staff are now focused on it, we've now got staff asking respondents to provide a good score on surveys. This is caused by all this emphasis on score, and I would say it devalues by about 100% any feedback you do receive. You're never sure what the actual score is. Was the customer happy, or did the customer just put a 9 or a 10 so they didn't get a callback, or whatever it is? So these are really important ideas about the service performance piece. So putting too much focus on Net Promoter Score as a score doesn't necessarily work that well.
And in fact, I would say it devalues the whole process. So as an antidote, if you like, rather than track NPS scores at the front line and probably even the team level, you might want to consider focusing on response rates. And there are really good reasons why response rate is so good. Staff can impact response rate. Like if we've seen earlier that staff can't necessarily impact on Net Promoter Score customer service if they don't have the tools and things like that, and that NPS doesn't drive them to do that. Incentives doesn't drive them to do that anyway. But they can impact on response rate. They can do you might receive a survey, please respond, we're really keen to hear what you say back. That little tiny piece of interaction with the customer can really lift response rates. And the cool thing about that is actually, if your goal is to collect as much feedback as possible, that's exactly what you're doing now. You are collecting a whole stack of extra feedback that you would never have gotten, and that feedback is much more valuable. So while you will be reporting on Net Promoter Score in your report, of course, because that's what you would expect to do, I would also urge you very much to report on response rate in your report as well. And if you're going to track and focus frontline staff, and this is kind of a bit beside the point, but if you're going to track frontline staff, focus them more on response rate. So at a team level or store level or a personal level, say, actually, one of your goals is response rate. We don't care what customers say. We just want to know we just want you to help build up the response rate. That's a really important point, I think. So that's all about, that's number 3, tracking response rates to reduce score begging. So the next one is about reporting and how often you should report. So the next element of reporting is the timeline, if you like, on the reporting. So we've done some research over the years and identified that organizations are more successful, and this is strictly an empirical process. There's no kind of psychological theory in this. It's just what we know works for organizations. If organizations report, and they report at least monthly, maybe more often, but at least monthly around customer feedback, then the organization will be more successful, significantly more successful than if they don't report monthly. So this is a really important point. So this goes to actually some of how you might build your program, rather than having a couple of big survey processes once or twice a year. Try and focus on doing a little bit every month. That ability to get feedback from feedback from customers, and deliver that to staff on a monthly basis is really an important driver. It just highlights and brings up, I think, the importance of that information through the organization. So that's why it's so important, because we know that reporting in this monthly way will drive just more success in the program. So I would say absolutely report monthly at least. This is something that often gets left out of reporting that I also think is very, very important. And it's very important because it identifies how people can make a difference. So reporting the score is all very nice, but what's missing in the score reporting is if you don't have some driver importance reporting as well. So this is really talking about giving staff an understanding of how they can improve the score. So if you don't report on drivers, and identifying drivers is probably like a 4-webinar series, I think it's quite a big task, but make sure that you are identifying drivers and that you put them into the report as well, and put the driver input. This one's also got driver importance, so people can see exactly how important different areas of the business are, or different areas of the drivers are. Make sure you put this in, and make sure that it's well understood, and that people can understand how they can make changes. And I think this is really important because actually, as I say earlier, it's all about letting people know how they can make a difference. If people don't know how they make a difference, then they're not connected to the feedback that you're getting. The other thing I would say is that, and I've seen driver analyses with 50 different drivers. In practice, I think the number of drivers for most businesses is actually quite small, and the 80-20 rule typically works out to between 3 and 7 drivers for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons is there's only so many drivers you can keep in your head at any one time, and if it's more than 5 or 7, then you can't be actively working on those 5 or 7. Much better to be working on 3 or 4, or 5 or 6 that the business can actually make change on. So rather than trying to track 15 or 20 different low importance drivers, track the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 that are actually important to the business every day. And then people can focus on those and improve those, and it just becomes easier. It's just impossible for any person or organization to focus on too many things at once. So make sure you report on your score drivers in your NPS report. Make sure it's a part of the process. Yeah, there's a couple of questions coming in that I'll talk about at the end. So service recovery. So service recovery is a really important part of the Net Promoter process. It's important from cultural change perspective. It's important from just keeping customers. Customers are delighted to hear back that their survey hasn't gone into a kind of a wilderness, that actually somebody's read the survey and done something about it. So the follow-up process is enormously important for customers. So this service recovery and also Customer Gauge, which is a Net Promoter Score software system, has done some research and looked at all of their customers, and they've identified that organisations that do service recovery in an efficient and effective way generate 11 points of NPS improvement. Now, that's an average across all organisations, but that's a pretty substantial stack of NPS to get just for following up customers. What you also get out of following up customers is you get sales, because customers, when you talk to them, say, oh, actually now you've turned me around, I'd like to buy some more stuff from you. They make staff feel like the process is real and part of the business, so they're much more engaged. There's a whole bunch of stuff that service recovery does, but number one, it generates NPS improvement, and quite quickly if you do it effectively. So the next thing your NPS report should have in it is a report on service recovery. So you should be reporting on all areas of service recovery. So there's a couple of items here. So we're talking about number of cases. How many new cases have opened up? So what constitutes a new case just depends on the organisation. So you might say, well, we're gonna have all 0 to 2s open a support case, and we're going to do something with the 0s to 2s, or 0 to 5s, or 0 to 6s. Whatever it is, track that number of cases, new cases opened every month. And that's a really important stat to track. The second thing to track is the time to close, and you actually might want to track two things here. You don't want to report too many numbers, but you might also want to track time to act. And so we know of organisations that have got 2-hour service level agreements within their organisation, so that if a customer provides a low score, there is a requirement within that organisation to get back to that customer within 2 hours and commence the fixing process. So that's pretty aggressive to do that in 2 hours, but it's a pretty good target to have, and also their customers love it. Quite simply, their customers really love that feedback they get, and it lifts Net Promoter Score. So here I would say focus on service recovery, and also report on it as an important thing. And this top 95%, there's a lot of service reporting ideas out there, and this kind of top 95% is pretty good, because there's always going to be 5% that are going to take too long to close, or are going to mess up the stats and make it look incorrect. So report on service recovery. Make sure in your NPS report you're also reporting on service recovery, because it's a really important part of the process. Now I want to talk a little bit about seasonality. So we've been doing this NPS thing for quite some time, and what we see is a lot of seasonality in data. And this is where, just to explain for anybody who's not aware of seasonality is all about how scores can change through the year. And I'll give a really simple example. If you run a business that has accountants as your customers, say, and at the end of the financial year, that business is going to come under a lot of pressure from accountants who want service as the year comes to an end. So unless you can easily scale your workforce, your support workforce, the scores are going to get a little bit lower as your response times blow out a little bit, as the business doesn't react as well to that customer load as they do at normal times. so your scores are going to fall off. Now, this seasonality is actually very, very common. We see it in many, many sorts of businesses. And the problem is the seasonality can really mess with your ability to interpret the data. So you really should take seasonality into account. So here's some data. Just looks kind of not very interesting. Some peaks and some troughs. That's, you know, what we do. We might want to go and look at all those peaks. But the first thing we need to do is say, well, actually, how is this score changing over time, or how is this data changing over time? And you'll see there's a bit of a trend. It's a good trend. It's an uptrend. So that's, everybody should be happy with that. So the score's going up. So when you deal with seasonality, you have to first say, well, is there a trend in the data? And if there is a trend in the data, how do we pull that trend out before we start? So we can do some maths. Again, I'm not going to go into the detail of the maths here. That takes a little bit of time. I'm happy to talk about that offline. But one of the things we can do is just do a seasonal adjustment, and the maths isn't particularly challenging. It's just a little bit complex, not complex, but just a bit long-winded, that's all. But once you get it up and running, it's actually quite easy to manage. So what you'll see here is the blue line is the actual NPS, and the yellow line or the orange line is actually the seasonally adjusted score. And I think what's cool here, what's interesting to note here, is some of those higher peaks and lower lows, actually when you start seasonally adjusting, they're not so out of line with trend. They're not so out of line with what's going on in the organization. So all of a sudden this area over here doesn't look quite so bad. You know, it's like, well, that actually wasn't quite as bad as we thought. And that's because you need to adjust this seasonally. So that's the first thing you need to do. But that data is a little bit hard to work with, I'll be honest. It's still a little bit difficult to work through. So if we take the assumption that the absolute NPS is just arbitrary, essentially your absolute NPS is arbitrary in space, then you can maybe just score your score relative to the trend. So maybe you just show a bit of data like this. So this is not seasonally adjusted yet. So you have high and low, you have kind of some break point through, you know, you've done your maths and you say, well, plus this and minus that. That gives me the point at which it's kind of gone beyond what a real change should look like. So that's a pretty cool way to look at it, and then you can just pull the dots out, and so you can see, you know, out of this, if we look at this data where there's maybe 7 events that we need to analyze. So you know, you can pick the ones where it goes to the blue lines and say, right, yeah, we need to look at those and understand what they mean. So 7 events. But if you then take that same idea of managing it to the trend, the long-term trend, and then you seasonally adjust it, this chart's a little bit hard to see, but I'll flick through to the next one, which we've done here. Again, you can see it just settles the chart down to what a real change is in the business, what's actually going on in the business. But then we get to this kind of seasonally adjusted view of the world relative to trend. So now we've actually got a really interesting chart, because now all of those really high highs and low lows have been removed, and now what we're seeing are the things that actually make a difference in the business, or the things that are real. And so we've gone from essentially 7 events to analyze, and I would say, so we've gone from 7 events to analyze to 3 events to analyze. So if we take one step back and look at those 7 events, there must be at least 4 similar events that we're jumping at shadows. We're looking at stuff that doesn't exist. We're trying to explain things that actually there's no explanation for. So we can't explain them. It's impossible. So we're going to be going to management and saying, well, we don't know why this has happened. There's a good reason you don't know why this has happened, because it hasn't happened. It's not statistically important or significant. But what we can do is work from the seasonally adjusted ideas, and then now we've just got these 3, and these 3 are probably real. And what's really interesting is that there's one here we would have missed. I'm going to go back a chart and show you where that is. But actually, we haven't kept 3 of the 7. We've actually kept 2 of the 7 and added another one. And that one we've added, this one here, we would have missed before. I'll go back and show you the chart again. So that's this one here. You see on the orange chart, it kind of sneaks in just around the line, so we probably would have ignored it. This one here, you know, that's a real outside of trend, seasonally adjusted thing. So I hope you can see that the seasonally adjusted thing can be quite important. It does depend a little bit on the business and the volume of data and things like that. But for most businesses that we've come across, there is some seasonality at some way in the business. So be really aware of that seasonality adjustment, because it's really important. Okay, and the last thing, second last thing, to weigh or not to weigh. So this whole idea about weighing different data sets and you know, if we have a B2B business, we have decision makers and end users, but there's lots more end users than decision makers. We have big divisions and small divisions. How do we roll their numbers up? So weighing is quite important, but it can be quite difficult to do effectively and can cause us many problems as it solves, to be honest with you. So we could calculate this information normally. We could average then calculate the data. So we could take decision makers, get a net promoter score for decision makers, or average the would recommend score for decision makers. Then we could average the would recommend score for end users, then calculate NPS. It kind of causes a few problems. I'll show you in a sec. Or we could calculate NPS for decision makers and then calculate NPS for end users and then weigh them together, putting some kind of a decision maker is worth 10 times an end user or something. So you can do this weighing approach, and there's pros and cons to it on all sides. So let's take an example of this. So we've got a B2B client here with 30 end users and 30 end user responses with an NPS of 70, of minus 70 in this case. 3 decision makers with an NPS of minus 33. So if you calculate the NPS normally, it's minus 57. If we do this average would recommend and then calculate, it's minus 100. The problem there is we've gone from a whole range of scores to basically just 5 scores, minus 100, minus 50, 0, plus 50, plus 100. So again, it's, you know, you lose a lot of information doing that. Or you can do the, you know, calculate the score and then weigh them. You know, so we say a decision maker is worth 10 times an end user, so we weigh the data up like that. So there are a couple of ways you can do this. To be honest, it's quite difficult to do it in a way that adds value. So sometimes it's best just to report them separately, to report end users separately from decision makers, or division A separately from division B. Because trying to average them together, there's always going to be discussions and arguments and pros and cons. So I would typically say just keep them separate and run them and show them as separate areas and separate parts of the business. Whatever you do, you need to be consistent in what you do, as in all of Net Promoter reporting. The next thing we've got here is tracking NPS related projects. So the last thing I would say is that you need to focus the business, and this comes back to this idea of focusing the organization on what you want it to do. The last thing you need to come back to, I would say, is this idea of focusing on outcomes, not inputs. So you want to have some way to tell the business, hey, this is what we're doing with all this data. We've got some new projects started, we've got some projects in process, we've got some projects ending, et cetera, et cetera. So this again is the goal of the reporting, is to focus the business on what you're doing. And I think when I show you the kind of a sample or a template report in a couple of seconds, you'll see that the score is a very small part of the overall process, and what's really important is the things that we're doing and the understanding that we're delivering from this Net Promoter Score process. So here I would say focus the business on the projects. Now they might be small or large, or they might be teams, you know, have some way to say, well, this is what the organization is doing with the information in a consistent and easy to understand way. And I think that's a really important process, because this is the outcome, after all, that you're trying to get to, is changing the business. So what I want to do now is I just want to show, and this is a template only of an NPS report, and you'll get this in the follow-up email that comes out after the webinar. The goal here is to just show you the sorts of things that you can put in. Now you might want to change the colors or the layout or the format, but the basic ideas are pretty solid here. So you can see that we track NPS because it's a Net Promoter Program update. You see it says monthly because we talked about monthly a few minutes ago. and how the score changes, you'll see that there's actually a significant change kind of highlighter here. Actually, I've got, that should say N, not Y. You can see there's a significant change highlighter here. So you can go in and say, hey, it's a change up or a change down in a significant way. So we can point out the things that are there, and you can add the seasonality into this idea as well. You'll see that we have a program implementation part of the project, of the report as well. It talks about the projects that were open at the start of the month, the new projects, projects closed, projects at the end of the month. So this again gives an idea of what's going on in the business. You'll see service recovery is in here as well. So number of cases, time to close, percentage. And you can put, if you want to put higher limits or goals, those sorts of things, you can absolutely do all that stuff, and you can make this more and more sophisticated in the reporting. And then the last thing we talk about is driver importance. So we get to that driver idea. But what I'm really hoping you see out of this is, yes, this is a Net Promoter Report, and here's the score. The score is essentially one line in the entire report. All the other things that are actually, I would say, more important than the score, things like the projects that you're doing, the response rate, all those sorts of areas actually get a lot more say. And I think if you add this other detail into your reports, then it will detract from that target fixation that everybody has around the score, around the score, around the score. If you only did one thing, I would put the significant change bars on there, because management will react to changes, and you have to be able to tell them what a real change is and what a non-real change is. Otherwise, you'll spend your entire time explaining things. Typically, you'll be explaining things that aren't changes. Like we just saw earlier with the seasonality adjustment, that out of the 7 things, only 2 were real changes. That's a lot of time spent explaining something that's not wrong and that's not different. So that's a really important part of the process. So they're the 9 things. They're the 9 areas. I've just shown the sample report. So what we've covered today are some high-level issues. So NPS is sampled and not exact, so you need to do some stats. I'm sorry, but just a fact of life. Focusing on the score is not very useful, but it is easy, so give people other things to look at. Some scores just seem wrong, so maybe you should change them. I'm really glad to see so many people not changing them, and just don't change them. It'll save you a lot of time. There'll be some arguments when you first start the process, but just put a policy in not to change anything. Integrating top-down and bottom-up, you can't. Now the 9 elements. You need an approach to handle small sample sizes, and we talked about that at the rolling idea. You need to include stats to clearly identify real changes, and we talked about that, and you can see how that turns up on the report. Track response rates to reduce score begging, so focus frontline staff on response rates and focus the organisation on response rates, not necessarily on the score, especially the frontline. Report at least monthly, because it works. Report on score drivers so that the people in the organisation understand what's driving the score. Report on service recovery, so make sure you do that service recovery reporting, because it's so important to the business and it drives such a lot of value. Work from the seasonally adjusted values for action. So when you're deciding on actions, try to seasonally adjust it, and we can talk about that a little bit. To weigh or not to weigh, typically I would try not to weigh, because it just introduces more questions. I hope one of the big things that you see out of this is actually focus less on the score, more on the doing, because that's the important part of the process. And track NPS related projects, because that's a really important part of the process as well. I do have a couple of questions coming in here. I've just got 1 or 2 slides, and then we'll go to questions, because there's some really good questions coming in. One thing I wanted to talk about was a thing called CX Tribe. So we've taken a lot of the ideas that we've learned over the last 15 years in Genero, the company, and we're rolling it out into an online training resource covering things like how to do root cause analysis, how to link NPS to the driving change, how to publish small sample sizes. Thing is, we're not accepting members at the moment. It's a bit sad, but we're not accepting members for that at the moment. But one of the things I noticed in the question part coming out of the earlier, you know, when you registered for the webinar, one of the big questions we got was all around response rates. It just seems to be always a concern for people. So we've actually opened up just one course on the site so that people can log in and get that response rate course. So it teaches you how to improve your response rates and what you can do to improve response rates. So if you're interested in that, grab that, and it'll teach you how to lift your response rates a little bit. But it's only for attendees. That link there is not available anywhere, certainly on the website, that's for sure. So, okay, let's talk about a couple of things, and then I'll get to questions. So there'll be a follow-up email that'll talk about the net report. That'll have links to the report template and also the comparison tester, and I'll talk about that in a few seconds. And then there's a link to the response rate course here. So let me have a look at a couple of questions. We've got 5 or 6 minutes here for questions. I probably should go from the top down. That seems a bit fairer, doesn't it? Is the webinar being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded, so that'll come through. Somebody, John Sadley, John, you asked about linking NPS remuneration, and does that promote score fixation? I would say that absolutely promotes score fixation, and I would absolutely say don't give anybody on the front line an NPS score. I would say don't even give at the team level an NPS score. You have to give NPS score goals to people who are in a position to make changes to the system. And a frontline person can be as nice as they like. I would argue your responsibility is to hire frontline people that have the right personality to be frontline staff. So that's your job in the first place. But linking it to, but they don't have the ability to make change in the business. They can't change policy typically. They can't change the business systems you're using, all those sorts of things. So linking it to remuneration just doesn't work. Link frontline staff to response rate, much better that way. Okay, so there's a question here from Marcio around is there a preset formula to calculate drivers? No, there isn't a preset formula to calculate drivers, unfortunately. That's quite a complex task, not something that we could handle in this webinar or probably even a 2 or 3 webinar series. But it is, we are working on pulling together a process for people that they can kind of digest easily. But essentially you need to analyze the data. It's actually just hard work. People misunderstand sometimes and they think that finding the drivers is just running a formula and get the drivers and that's easy. It's not quite that easy, but it is the most important thing you can do probably, I think. How do you calculate significant change? Again, that's quite a complex conversation and I don't think it's something that works well in a webinar. The blog post I've linked to, and you'll get a link to this NPS comparison tester, will give you a downloadable Excel tool that allows you to do that. It's really quite, you just plug the numbers in and it tells you has it changed or has it not changed. Score drivers. I'm not sure, Jenna, exactly what you want me to talk about on the score driver side, but the drivers are the things in the business that the business can change that will lift the score. Typically in most businesses, things like responsiveness and do what you say you will do are great score drivers. They're the things that you tell people if you do that, the score will go up. Vincent asks about not comparing top down and bottom up. Yeah, actually Vincent says when you say you can't compare top down and bottom up scores, do you mean we can't try to correlate NPS scores with sales increase or other company measures? No, I don't mean that. You should absolutely be looking to validate your NPS score changes against lifts and falls in NPS, against lifts and falls in revenue. Most of our customers have been able to link NPS score changes to revenue or profitability in some particular way, or in some way that's relevant to their business, or it might be retention rates or whatever. You should absolutely do that. That's almost kind of number 2 thing you should do is to try and get that data, because that's data that allows you to drive projects and fund projects in your business around improving the scores. That's a really important thing to do, actually. There's one or two other questions. Hang about, we just got one here. Too many folks score 5 because they feel neither one way or the other. Why not mark the scale at 7? So, Del, you've asked a question there about why detractors are 0 to 6s and neutrals are 7s and 8s and promoters are 9s and 10s. That set 0, 6, 7 to 8, 9 and 10 is an empirical calculation that was done in the development of the Net Promoter Score process. So what they identified was that whilst it may seem that a 5 is neutral, actually a 5 doesn't add value to your business, and actually 7 or 8 is more neutral. So that's an empirically based idea, and it just kind of lies at the very heart of Net Promoter Score and how the process works. So no point kind of worrying, I guess, about that. And as I said earlier, the score is not the absolute score doesn't matter. It's the relative change in score that should be important for you. So don't worry too much about that, because it's just the way the system works, and we know it works reliably. So just one more question here that talks about performing seasonality calculations. I didn't go into it in detail. Around how exactly you do the seasonality calculations. They aren't particularly complex. I'll probably write them up in a public forum sometime in the near future, because there are lots of different ways you can do it, and I think there's some simpler ways that are really effective and some less simple ways that just take a little bit longer to do. So I'll probably write that up at a later date, but they aren't that complex, just a little bit long-winded sometimes, that's all. So we are really at the top of the hour. Thank you everybody for attending. I really enjoyed presenting today. I hope you've found something of use. We'll send a link out after this. It'll probably come out maybe on Monday at this point. But have a good weekend everybody. Enjoy yourself, and look forward to seeing you on the very next webinar. Thanks guys.